Musa, please.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to everybody at Hauser Wirth for making this possible. And I hope that those who are not in New York listening to this symposium and watching today will be able to take advantage of the extraordinary exhibition that has just opened yesterday at Hauser Wirth and will be on view until the end of October. It's of my father's last works from 1969 to 79, and we think it's really a remarkable exhibition and one that we have been thinking about for many years. So I am not only Philip Guston's daughter, I'm also the president of the Guston Foundation. And I want to talk a little bit this morning about the foundation and our website, which is easy to find at philipguston.org. The reason I want to speak about that is because today we will hear new voices, artists, art historians, and others speaking about Philip Guston and his impact on their lives and their work. And this is something that we've been archiving and that is documented on our website going all the way back almost to the beginning of his career. And I think it's a testimony to the power of my father's work that people, many people are finding new ways of understanding the richness of it and the possibility of the work to be interpreted through one's own experience and through whatever is going on in society at any given moment. And this is quite the moment, as I think we all understand. So I'm sure you'll be hearing today about the relevance of the work in a new way, in a completely new way. So it's been my pleasure to be a part, to direct the archiving of all those references and to sort of participate in that process going forward. And I hope you'll all have a chance to explore the depth of our resources at some point at philipguston.org. So without further ado, I am really eager to hear what new voices and voices that have been expert you're going to be hearing first, I think, from Rob Storr, whose wonderful major book was published not long ago, and who always has fascinating things to say, and later from Mark Godfrey, to amazing lectures, and then panels and artist responses that I'm sure will surprise and intrigue us all. So thank you very much for coming, and those online for listening.
Thank you, Musa. And our first speaker, as she said, will be Rob Storr, art historian, writer, painter, and the former dean of the Yale School of Art.
As you can tell from my wobbly gait, I'm not only one of the older voices, but I'm one of the older people. Not that old, but so much so that I can feel it in ways I never did before. I've written frequently and at length about Guston, and so I'm going to just deal with some issues, knowing full well that I'm leaving a great deal out. But the first thing to say about Guston is that he bound it all together. And some of his last images are of these balls that are sort of embedded with objects that they picked up on the way downhill. And that is the sum total of his importance to us now. He is that whole ball of wax, all of those things picked up along the way, all of them reorganized by the descent, or the rise in some cases. But in any case, I'm going to take one tack and I hope you understand that it is not the only one. I am not going to do a topical lecture per se, but it will seem like one in some ways. And in that sense, I want to sort of address the elephant in the room. The elephant is there because other people dropped the ball when it came time to do the first version of this show. And it was a learning moment where nobody learned anything. It was a teaching moment, rather, where the teachers didn't learn enough to do the teaching. Now I think we're in a different position, and I think we can do it to good effect, both for Guston's sake and for the sake of the public at large. Now, James Joyce famously said, "History is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake." And the Spanish philosopher George Santayana is credited with the aphorism, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." What follows will simply be an effort to situate an exceptionally alert and thoughtful and self-contradictory sensibility in his historical moment, to flesh out the history component of art history so that the art part will be seen less anomalous. This past Labor Day weekend, I was vividly reminded of the truth of Santayana's statement. I was in Saco, Maine, which is my home state, staying with a group of friends in the house of a couple that had been neighbors of ours in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn. She is also a Mainer, as they now say. We used to call ourselves maniacs. Let me see if what the... I'm also digitally impaired. This doesn't have a scroll bar. Okay, let me do this. Okay. There we go. No. I hate these things. Jesus. I'm dyslexic, and everything that's left, right, and you can't see it half the time, and so on is just nuts. Okay, let's go back to here, which is where I wanted to start. And then I want to go back to this side and scroll down. How do I scroll down on this side? I can't, no, I don't want that. No. Can somebody come up here and help me? I want to be on this side, and I want to be able to scroll down. No, the slide that we have up is the right one. The one that is the column of text on the side, which I want to be able to scroll down.
So,
This, I want to be on this side, and I want to be able to scroll it down. Long ago, I remember when Kurt Varnagel gave a talk at Rockefeller University, and the machine jumped from his first slide to his last slide without being prompted. And it ruined the point that he wanted to make, but Kirk was a great performer, so he simply picked up his stuff and started over again. So I'm going to take Kirk's advice or model and try and do it here. Before in the warm-up, I could scroll this down. Why can't I do it now? Okay.
Unfortunately, it's 2 fingers.
It's 2 fingers, okay.
2 fingers that are scrolling.
That wasn't told. Okay, so here we go. Now, I think we're past this. Okay, fine. Now back, okay. Back to my little vignette. I was in Maine, I was in Saco, Maine. I was with friends from Brooklyn, and she is Catholic, as is her whole family, and her husband is Jewish. Now, this is significant because they live in Saco, and Saco was once one of the headquarters for the northern branch of the Ku Klux Klan. And indeed, as a state as whole, was riven with Klaverns. It was a state which was deeply, deeply, deeply invested in nativist American thought and actions and hostile behavior towards strangers. And it is that I want to address in part because the example of being in Maine is like being in Montana, is like being in a lot of lily white places that think they are the pinnacle of American truth or whatever it is, and are not, of course. But it is also a reminder that the people who were hated in Maine were not the same people who were hated in the South. There are almost no blacks in Maine when she was growing up, or when I was there very young. But the people who were hated basically were Catholics and Jews. And the Catholics and the Jews were the targets of hostility from the nativists because they were the newcomers. They were the Irish, they were the Slavic peoples, they were the French Canadians, and so on and so on and so forth. So the people who got hated were people who came into Maine who might conceivably take jobs from the people who were there, who were in any case not of the same faith because it was an overwhelmingly Protestant state, and the Klan is a Protestant organization, one has to say that. And so the impact of the Klan was to focus attention on Catholics and Jews, more so than blacks, in this phase, which is the second phase of the Klan's incarnation. The first phase was the phase that everybody knows, they think anyway, quite well, which was the Reconstruction era rebellion against the new regime of a free slave society and of northern domination of southern culture. I was last night watching Birth of a Nation for the first time in many, many, many years. Periodically, I watch Gone with the Wind for the same reason, to remind myself of how utterly benighted one can actually be and how you can at the same time make it artful. But in any case, this is ready-made. Up is down, down is up, left is right, right is left. If you're dyslexic, this is hell. Okay. In any case, the Klan in the 20s, which came back in the 20s in full, is the Klan that Philip Guston grew up with. And he grew up with it in close proximity because another one of its headquarters was Anaheim, California, in Southern California, near where he grew up. It is also, incidentally, the Klan that our former president grew up in, or at least that his father grew up in, since Donald Trump Sr., sort of was drawn to the lure of the burning cross. Now, that Klan, as I said, was primarily focused on anti-immigration, anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, and also abidingly anti-black sentiments. But it was not just one, it was all of them. It was a wholesale rebellion and rejection of a modernity which was mixed, marbled, and in all kinds of ways complicated. And it was the fear of complications that made it so. Now, as it happened, Philip Guston came to Southern California, where he settled. His family is Goldstein, by way of Montreal. And Montreal is not part of this immediate situation that I was describing, but it's the hinterland for an awful lot of the people who went to Saco. And they came at the invitation of the Statue of Liberty and of our Constitution. So other people who came included, for example, the Russian Orthodox people who came after the Russian Revolution. And I remember going to the church in Thompson that looked for all the world like an ordinary congregational church, but it had a blue onion dome on top of it. And the organist was a member of the Tolstoy family. The interior was filled with incense. It was partitioned the way Russian churches are. And on the public side of the partition, not the holy side, were standing stock-still men in Cossack boots. That was the reality in Topsom, Maine. And it was still, I think, probably the reality, although those men must now have gone beyond. In any case, Maine was, in fact, welcoming to some immigrants, but only some immigrants, and it was not welcoming to others. In due course, of course, naturally, a number of people settled from other places, and in the generation of my parents, they were heavily from Eastern Europe. From Western Europe, many of them were scholars who'd been chased out by the Nazis, so that you could go to little towns and meet people who had collections of the Goethe first editions in their living rooms. They were people who were students at the Warburg Institute or even faculty at the Warburg Institute in Germany and so on. So Maine was a surprisingly cosmopolitan state within certain enclaves, but otherwise it was a deeply, deeply, deeply leveling, nativist, and in many ways racist state. In any case, in Maine, the replacement fears that were voiced in the march in Charleston were not about replacement by blacks. It was about replacement by Jews. That was the thing that they worried about, and that's in fact what the people in Charleston actually chanted. The Jews will not replace us. And so anti-Semitism cannot be underestimated when one looks at Klanish images, and that is something that practically nobody in Washington paid any attention to when they talked about this situation. Now, this is not to say in any way that the enslavement and denigration of African Americans is to be overlooked because somebody else suffered. It's just that the reverse is also not to be true because African Americans suffered disproportionately. That means the other suffering does not get diminished. And in fact, you don't create competitions among communities for their suffering. I think precisely what Steve Bannon wants to do is to make ethnicity identification the sole criteria of everybody's thinking, and then to pit everybody against everybody else in terms of their situation. Now, this country, in fact, has been a refuge for a great many people who have been persecuted, but has also been the site of persecution for a great many others. And that is the paradox of this country that we are still living out, working out, and trying to figure out, which is one of the reasons that Guston is so apropos. He is not apropos only because of these political and social factors, but there is hardly an artist that I can think of who makes them more vivid, more poignant, and more difficult, frankly. Okay, now, when Guston began to do his images of the Klan in the 1960s, early 1960s, 1962, 63, it seemed to come out of nowhere. And I indeed didn't really quite understand the depths of his entanglement in this history until relatively recently. And I tried to address it somewhat in the book that I've just published, but I realized it could have gone much further. I wrote in the book, for example, that Woodrow Wilson had the Birth of a Nation screened at the White House as an indication of how racist this country was. What I did not know is that Woodrow Wilson's own words appear in the script, in the text scripts that explain the film. So the President of the United States is quoted in this racist film as a voice on American history. And what he says is hair-raising. Now, this is a man who did some other good things, but racism amongst people who were, if you will, well-bred, and deep racism amongst people who were well-bred was not uncommon. In fact, in my own family, I know very well that it was not uncommon. So if that's the case, and anti-Semitism too, I had an aunt who was a fantastic person, but she was a casual anti-Semite the way many, many, many people of her generation were. So I would hear her talk about what a wonderful concert, some refugee pianist had just done, some Jewish refugee, Archer Rubinstein, had done, and then make a crack about Jews. So this was very common, and this is something that Guston's work brings to the surface. The degree to which we are not really so self-conscious about our own racism and about the racism of those around us. And being self-conscious doesn't solve the problem, but it's a predicate for doing anything about it at all. Now, when Guston did this, which is to say made the shift from his abstract paintings into paintings of the Klan images and others that followed, he was not doing it to sort of satisfy the political or social views of the liberal intelligentsia of that time. In fact, they were horrified. Or if that's what he was doing, he really miscalculated, because the rejection of his work at that time was across the board. And it was across the board from his friends, as well as from those who superintended the art scene, most notably Hilton Kramer. It was also interesting that Robert Hughes, who attacked it, but sort of marginally understood it, that Robert Hughes said that it was very strange that he should have picked this particular subject since it seemed already dated. Why would one do this now? Well, I think one finds out very quickly, first of all, that he did have other things on his mind that made an explanation possible, and that other things were prevalent. When I was doing research for the book, I talked to Michael Elias, who's the son of Fred Elias, who was one of Guston's close friends and at whose house he died. And he said that he remembers hearing talk from Guston about thinking about the Birmingham church bombing in 1963 in an African-American church in which the Ku Klux Klan, those guys, bombed the church and killed 4 little girls. And then within no time at all, there were further events. So for example, the civil rights freedom riders, Andrew Goodman, a relative of Marion Goodman's, Michael Schwerner and James Chaney, and James Chaney, were killed by night riders of the Ku Klux Klan in modern dress. They didn't wear horses, and they didn't ride horses, and they didn't wear white robes. They wore, work clothes, and they drove cars. But they were doing exactly the same thing has been done 100 years before during Reconstruction. And they drove these guys off the road, killed them, and stuck the car in a swamp. Now, that was just one of many, many, many such acts from the early 1960s to the end of the 1960s and into the 70s. So the Klan was not an historical relic. It was a burning issue, literally. And it was a horrifying issue. And if you consider this, and now I can go to the slide. Oh, sorry, here we go again. This is the first slide. When this march was mounted in 1926, this is a march of the Klan in Washington. This is the hoods on Pennsylvania Avenue. This is how intimate the relationship was between this kind of reactionary politics and actual government politics. And as I say, they already had a man in the White House, Woodrow Wilson, in generations previous. So when this photograph was taken, Guston was 13, a very impressionable age. And I think before he became political sort of 4 or 5 years later. But this is something that could not have escaped his notice again, because the Klan was vociferously anti-Semitic, vociferously anti-immigrant, vociferously anti-everything that was not their very narrow definition of white American culture was to be. And if you think of our kids now growing up in this present circumstance, what they will remember of what happened in Seattle, or what I remember of what happened in Chicago and Los Angeles and other places in the 60s, those things go very deep, and they don't go away either. So that if Guston was reminded of what was going on in the 20s, or teens even, because the Klan was active as of 1915, before that even, but that's really when, okay. If Guston was reminded of those things amidst the actual turmoil in this country during the Nixon era and during the end of the war in Vietnam, that is not a surprising thing. That is not anomalous. That is actually a very, very sophisticated response to a very, very nagging provocation. And I dare say that in the present context, people who have been radicalized earlier in their phases of their lives are going to do a better job at being political artists now than some of the ones who start from scratch as if being a political artist is a job description. It isn't. It's making political art is working through things that are deeply embedded in you, like any other part of your sensibility, like any other part of your consciousness. And that's what happened, I think, in the early 60s. Guston was doing very well, not just professionally, but in every other sense artistically, making paintings of a certain kind. And it's not just that he couldn't do it the way he was doing it with the pressure of events around him, but that there was another opportunity that he saw. An opportunity not just to address the present circumstances, but also past traumas, past experience of isolation, alienation, exclusion, et cetera, et cetera. And if that's the case, then it's not surprising that he did it. It is surprising he did it the way he did it, and that's where his genius lies. But this whole situation is the elephant in the room in terms of Guston scholarship. You cannot walk around it. You cannot explain it as a blip on the screen. You cannot explain it as the last phase of a long career, which might have gone on longer. I wish it had. But no, it's really, this was unattended business that was deeply inside him that he then attended to in ways that nobody could have predicted. I'm sorry, but when I did that technical mistake, I also lost my place in this scrolling thing that they have. I wish somebody who designs these things would ask about how they're used. Here we go. Okay, now, when the bombing of the Sunday school, the Birmingham Church Sunday bombing took place, it was immediate that men were arrested. 21 were arrested, not immediately, but relatively quickly, and indicted in 1967, which is 4 years after the event. Only one was ever convicted, and that was 40 years after the event. So if you think about things that are festering under the surface of this society, just look at those hard facts. Out of all the people who were indicted, 21, and out of all the people who were indicted 4 years after the fact, and we're looking at how long we've waited for some kind of an indictment about the January 6th events, we're actually on a fast track by that standard. But the other part of it is that only one man was ever convicted for it. Everybody else got off and could laugh up their sleeves or return to communities of people who felt just like them but hadn't taken that fateful step. So Guston's metamorphosis back into a history painter, which is where he started, was not a mistake. As I said, Time Magazine's Robert Hughes said that this was a little late in the century to mount an entire exhibition on the Ku Klux Klan. It was actually premature for the 21st century. So he was doubly wrong. He was not late in terms of events of the moment for him, but he was ahead of the curve in terms of events in our lives. Now, as I said, the sort of the wide fan of hatreds that the Klan represents is something that needs to be addressed. And it needs to be addressed. Why? Because that wide fan identifies potential coalitions of people who could be working together. When Guston made the lynching images that were early in his career, that were the cause of some of the, resentments of some people in Washington, consider the context. It was said by somebody in a high position that he was appropriating the suffering of African Americans. He wasn't appropriating it. He had no illusions about whether or not he had suffered that way, although he was in a position to suffer that way had he been unlucky in Southern California or the other places he lived, because he was Jewish. But the important thing was he was expressing solidarity with people who were threatened as he was, and he knew that they were threatened more than he was. So to express solidarity is an important, fundamental political way of thinking about the world, and it is one that has been decimated by this way of talking about Guston's work, because you are not allowed to have solidarity with somebody. You have to speak from the position of the victim in order to speak at all, and that is nonsense. And it is also highly helpful to the people who are committing atrocities, who are acting out the persecutions. There was in the 30s, I'm not that old, but I am old, there was in the 30s a term called United Front, and it was something that mostly existed as on the left, and it was mostly an attempt to rally the left against their common enemies. The time that the United Front came into common conversation and came into it in European politics, French politics particularly, was when fascism began to rise. And now is the time to make common cause. Now is the time to think about united fronts. Now is the time to get past all the rhetoric of who is right, who is wrong, who is safe, who is unsafe, who has got the right to something and who does not. Now we have to realize that somebody has their eye on us all, and we need to fight with all that we've got to get past them, and all that we've got is each other. Now, as I said before, Guston came from Southern California. He was fascinated by comics. He was fascinated by film. He was fascinated by the vernacular arts. And the vernacular arts also stood in a sort of humbled position as a result of a series of political and class prejudices. Art Spiegelman, who's here, he's going to talk to later on, and I have had discussions about this at length. At one point, I wanted to persuade the drawings department at MoMA to actually create a department of cartooning or of cartoons, because it is not a minor art at all. It is a major art. There's cartooning that goes way, way back. And in the show that I did at David Zwirner's on Robert Crumb, I displayed some Gilroy's, some Thomas Nast and others, to prove that there is a very clear lineage formally and lineage iconographically and lineage in terms of its ambiguous social status for cartooning. And it is time that we brought that in. Now the model for MoMA is very simply the film department. The film department found a way to treat film as an art form, and not just art films as an art form, but films that were commercial, films that were entertainment, frankly, and films of all kinds. I think it's way past time that American museums do the same thing. Begin to say that anything that is made by artists that is of a certain caliber, a certain quality, if you'll pardon that old formalist expression, that is of a certain quality, deserves to be seen by the general public and considered in the whole range of things that could be made, and that then the difficulty that Guston had as being damned for having gone into cartooning, having become, as Hilton Kramer famously said, a mandarin who became a stumblebum, would be obviated. There would be no question but that, he had not only the right, but the historical precedent. And if you think of who did this already, Raphael, Goya, any number of other people did both cartooning, the Berninis, the Tiepolo's, any number of artists of the first rank who made fine art also made cartoons, which are a fine art. They're not anything else but a fine art, even if some of their jokes are crude and even if some of the drawing is inelegant. The inelegance actually takes real thought and care. And there again, Guston stands out. The so-called messy drawing of these last paintings is very, very carefully apportioned and not studied, but here we go. This is just to update the conversation because this is January 6th, and these are people breaking through or breaking up to and in through the doors of the Capitol. And on the other side is a painting called Entrance, which almost seems like a premonition of all of this. And I love these cockroaches that are on the ground. The cockroaches are, I don't know who exactly iconographically, but they are the lowest of the low. And the cockroaches tend to survive us all, we know, in nuclear holocaust, so they'll be around for a long time. In any case, this painting by Guston on this side and what goes on that side are intimately connected. Now, again, I don't think Guston's survival depends on being the predictor of events, and indeed he wasn't. But he was somebody who understood the dynamics of social reality, the dynamics of chaos in a pluralist society. He understood them in a way that allowed him to make metaphor images that are useful to think about now that we are in that mess. And I think that is something that is to be given. I'm not sure, I'm seeing time here, but I think I don't have that much time left. So I won't take too much more. But in any case, what Guston did was he created images out of his enormous reserve of knowledge about images out of the past. No artist of his period was better art historically informed than was Guston. And he had visual memory for things. He didn't just have sort of book learning. And when people go to Guston and try and read the text of art history through him, they're off on the wrong track. What he did was he saw images as possibilities to say things and to re-say them, to rephrase them. So if he looked at Tiepolo, the fact that he did not choose an elegant line and wash the way Tiepolo did is an important decision. And the messiness of his paintings and the sort of slobberiness of the paint and so on and so forth is part of what he's talking about. It is the earthiness of the painting. It is the way in which he gets across the energy of the world that he sees simultaneously falling apart. And one of the things we are learning, I think, is that when things go down, they don't go down with a whimper, they go down with a bang and a shout and all kinds of other things, but they go down loudly and messily, and that is where the remaining vigor to be marshaled in other directions is there for us to look at and capture and channel if we can. But in any case, Guston was somebody who, this just happened again. The Guston was not a Mandarin, although he had extremely advanced erudition in art, and he had a very subtle touch. The early drawings of Guston are as refined as anything you can find in that period. And one of the paradoxes of his relation with Pollock was that Guston could do almost effortlessly what Pollock could never do. And so Guston made his way through the first part of his life trying to use that skill in making contemporary paintings. In a way, Pollock leapfrogged him by being inept, and he used his limited skills to forge a new language of drawing. Guston, in turn, doubled back and picked up the thread of his earlier career in terms of the iconography, but allied it with a way of handling paint that was the product of the abstract expressionist experiment, which he shared fully with Pollock and others as of 1950. The old rap on Guston was that he was late to the party. He wasn't. He was right on time. In fact, nobody else much other than de Kooning and Pollock were there before him. 1950 is the year that Barnett Newman painted his first important paintings. It's the time that Franz Klein painted his first important paintings. It's the time that many of the prime leaders of the abstract expressionist group hit their stride. So Guston was right on time. The difference is that he had a fully developed career to sacrifice that they did not. And Guston's courage in allowing his fame and his position and his security go in order to pursue this other thing is one of the reasons that I admire him so very much, because there are all kinds of people who have good ideas, and he had many. But he also had guts, and he had the guts to let go of something that was working, so-called, for him, and then to find something else that didn't work as well right off the bat, or maybe ever, but that carried more of what he wanted to bring to the occasion. And that was the conflict, the internal self-contradiction, the difficulties that he had, and so on. The very things that Hilton Kramer resented in him, the very things that Hilton Kramer could not come to terms with. And for what it's worth, Guston felt great remorse at having changed his name from Goldstein to Guston. Hilton, I don't think, ever did, but he is in the same situation, since he too was a converted Jew, or not a converted Jew, but a Jew who assimilated fully. He came, of all places, from Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is another place that I know well. And in Gloucester, Massachusetts, you could blend in if you wanted to, and then carry on in your other guys. So Hilton Kramer is a guy from the neighborhood who became a Mandarin and then beat everybody else over the head with his erudition, his knowledge about, what do you say, about T.S. Eliot and others. Guston never did that. And Guston's refusal to become what Hilton did become was the reason that Hilton disliked him so very, very much. Now, at least that's my proposal. And since I didn't know Guston, but I did know Hilton, I think it's well-founded. In any case, the other side is that Guston never forgot that the distance between him and his enemies was circumstantial, contingent, and not absolute. And the difference of experience was different. Now, in terms of that, he learned a great deal from the short stories of Isaac Babel. And Isaac Babel was a Russian shtetl Jew who went into the big city, became a well-known journalist, and then was sent out from Moscow to report on the Cossacks, who were the perennial enemies of the Jewish community. And he rode with the people who would have very cheerfully slaughtered him just years before the revolution. But they were now part of the revolution, and so he made common cause with them. And the whole business of having learned from a Russian writer who was Jewish and then Bolshevik, how to deal with an American situation as a Jewish, but in some ways no longer identifiably Jewish, painter dealing with the Ku Klux Klan is one of the sort of magical transpositions that happens in this whole story. And Guston's recognition that he was essentially, it was incumbent upon him to do what Babel had done, was to ride with the Cossacks or drive around with the Klan, was to identify with his adversary, with his enemy, with the enemy of his friends, to identify with them not in order to become them, but to imagine what they are like and why they are like that. Now again, in the world of identity politics, that's not permissible. You're not allowed to imagine what the evil parts of yourself are, but you know they're there. And you'll know they'll emerge sooner or later. Guston was fearless in imagining what they might be, and was also very funny about it because he understood that there was a certain kind of humorous irony in becoming your worst enemy. He also knew that your worst enemy is not so very different from you anyway. And one of his neighbors in Southern California was none other than young Dick Nixon. And so when he came up against Nixon as a subject in the 70s, he was thinking as a Southern California lower middle class boy, thinking about the options in front of him, the options in front of Dick Nixon. And so he drew cartoons in which Nixon is absurd, but he is not completely unsympathetic. He is pathetic, but not completely unsympathetic. And Guston's ability to identify with the unidentifiable enemy is what was going on in these paintings. And that is also something that makes it very hard for people who haven't the luxury of doing that, I won't call it a luxury, the ability to do that. But then, of course, there's the recent Spike Lee film about the black man who becomes a member of the Klan. And so, yes, you can. Actually, there are no limits. The minute people start identifying artistic options in terms of political givens that are unbudgeable, we are lost in art and in politics. So I'm going to round up here just with this image and just say that we know already now that 10 days from now there'll be a reprise of what's going on in the slide on the left. It should be the slide on the right, but on the slide on the left. We know that this could happen again. And we know that we're not out of the woods. We know that this is a nightmare from which we have not even come close to awakening. And in fact, this time we could actually lose the whole game. But if we do, it'll be at least in part because we didn't open our eyes, because we didn't rethink our sort of ordinary reflex responses to political ideas. We didn't use culture for the ways that it can be legitimately used to open up horizons rather than shut them down. And that the whole kerfuffle over the show in Washington is an example of how ridiculous that is and how costly. Let us hope that when this show is reconstituted and put back into the world, it's put back in a context that is not a sort of pedagogical way around difficult problems, but an active way of thinking into them. Thank you.